Barnes, attorney and drug policy advisor. Michael Barnes talking about the statement given to police, all the drugs that he gave Michael Jackson. You know, as we see it up here, this is very damaging stuff for Dr. Conrad Murray.
It is very damaging, and I'm concerned that now we're going to see that Conrad Murray is going to change his testimony, and that to me raises issues of ethical concerns that the defense attorneys really need to give some sheer consideration to. But with all these drugs in the system, it really becomes apparent to me that this is not an issue of abuse or addiction. Rather, this is an issue of medical misuse and perhaps dependence on anxiety medications, but we're not talking about someone who is using these medications in order to feel the euphoric effect or in order to, basically feed some sort of need that was non-medical in nature. This is really a result of the failing nature of the medical system when it comes to Michael Jackson's undertreated pain and anxiety.
And I think what's really interesting is that Dr. Murray didn't take any records, so all we have to go is his voice. Okay, straight out to Atlanta, news break with Susan Hendricks. But AEG didn't provide it. And this guy says, why would AEG provide resuscitation equipment that would be used with a surgical knockout drug? Of course a big corporation is not going to condone the use of a surgical knockout drug in the home. And it never really occurred to me that, oh my gosh, that whole argument really has a weak foundation. Why would they be providing all these? You've shown all the different technical, massive technical equipment that you have to have for surgical knockout drugs. AEG would never allow propofol to be administered?
No, that's absurd. I mean, Conrad Murray wasn't really practicing medicine when he was treating Michael Jackson with all those ridiculous medications in his bedroom, of all places. And so the notion that any corporation or any other medical practitioner, insurance company, drug company, anyone else would be complicit with that behavior is completely ridiculous, because really this is just unheard of negligent behavior. And that's what all of this is going to get down to, that the doctor did not follow the standard of care from the very get-go. Even at the beginning, upon taking this job in the first place, he had an option to say, okay, let's coordinate care. We're going to get you a sleep specialist. We're going to get you in a specialist. If I believe you have drug dependence, we'll get you an addiction medication specialist, a pain specialist, whatever. He could have coordinated care and used a real anesthesiologist, but he didn't. And that from the very get-go and there until the moment of death and trying to clean up his mess before calling 911, it just indicates all along he did not follow any appropriate medical standard of care.
We look at the situation, and let's say there was a way to set up propofol at a home setting, but we see that there are things missing in this. Dr. Conrad Murray, I suppose, could claim, well, I did the best I could under the circumstances. As Jane mentioned, he hasn't signed this contract yet. But at the same time, does he have a greater obligation to his patient that even if he hasn't signed that contract, that contract cannot trump the standard of care that he is expected to offer to his patient?
Precisely. Regardless of what his contractual or financial desires were, he had a standard of care that goes along with his licensure to practice medicine that he did not follow. And the concern here that I see is that from the very get-go, Conrad Murray was not putting his interests below those of Michael Jackson. He was putting his interests above those of Michael Jackson, doing what it took to keep his patient satisfied, which means basically it appears that he was following the crude treatment plan that Michael Jackson had to set up for himself in the absence of quality care from other practitioners to treat his chronic insomnia, potentially his pain, although we didn't see that there were opioid pain relievers in his system when he died, which is another indication that he wasn't necessarily abusing medications. So all in all, the facts are just really bad in this case, and Conrad Murray doesn't have much of a defense. Whatever he's going to try can easily be spun around and used by the prosecution to say, okay, if you say that he has an addiction, your standard of care is higher in someone who has an addiction. If you say that he's pushing these medications in himself, why did you leave him in the room with the medications in the first place? There's always a response to whatever defense will come out.
And what's so fascinating is there are more than a dozen deviations, some gross or extreme, some simple, from standard care. And as you go through the list, it's absolutely extraordinary. I mean, it's not just administering propofol in a home setting. Michael Barnes, he's saying, wow, if the kids testify, it opens the door for the defense to start asking them whether they've ever seen their dad high or slurring his words. And there have been reports, which I certainly can't independently confirm, that yes, the kids have seen that.
But that again raises the question that we have to discuss here, Jane, which is that we're talking about the medical misuse of medications, perhaps based on a need, a medical need that Michael Jackson had for chronic insomnia or chronic pain, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he was addicted. It means that he couldn't get adequate care from the healthcare system despite all of his resources, and he had to create some crude, rudimentary treatment plan himself in order to get the relief that he thought. Now, he wasn't getting sleep when he thought he was getting sleep. He was getting a coma induced by anesthesia, perhaps. But indeed, this is not necessarily a case of addiction. It could just be dependence based on a medical need that was not adequately treated.
No. Because Michael Jackson said on camera in 1993 that I become hooked on painkillers. And as a recovering alcoholic
right, but there were not painkillers in his system. Look at the autopsy report, though.
Always, but it doesn't matter. Once you are an addict, you are not, or an alcoholic, you're not supposed to take any mood-altering medications whatsoever. Like, okay, I'm a recovering alcoholic. That means I can't take Valium. That means I can't take any kind of a mood-altering medication unless basically my life depended on it. But it's not, oh, if you're an alcoholic, you just can't drink, but you can smoke pot. You're not supposed to do any mood-altering meds.
Well, what if that wasn't his standard,
with you on that.
What if he wasn't abiding by that standard? Go ahead, Michael. Go ahead.
I agree with you, Jane. You're absolutely right, and there's no doubt about that. But we have to go back, and I hope that the prosecution will go back to the fact that this was a medical need that was untreated, and that's the issue here in this case. From the facts in this case, there are not signs of addiction in the medical definition of the word, which is that it's continued use despite the harm. He was not suffering the legal or the social or the other sorts of consequences that go with typical addiction. He might have been showing signs of dependence and perhaps drug seeking. Yes, exactly.
Yes, he was.
But dependence
At the time of his
is
death, he faced 38 lawsuits. After the child molestation trial, he was $270 million in debt. Yes, there are many people who could argue at one point he owed more than $100,000 to one Beverly Hills pharmacy.
But not at the time of his death.
For prescriptions. But again, once an addict, always an addict, so I don't think it really matters. And that's where I think it's going to be hard to draw the boundaries in this case of what you can talk about and what you can't, and still be fair to Dr. Conrad Murray.
Well, let me jump in. Let me jump in for a second and bring in Sonny Hostin.
Have addiction close to home.
That's a good point. Let me bring in Sonny Hostin, though, with a credit. Yeah. No, you make a good point, Michael. Let me bring in Sonny Hostin for a second. You talk about responsibility. Michael Barnes, attorney, drug policy advisor. Michael Barnes, as I think about this, I think the defense tries to make this case about patient's responsibility versus a doctor who might have been trying to manage the pain or the issues that Michael Jackson was having, despite what seems to be care that just boggles the mind. This makeshift setup of propofol at home, this walking away from a patient who's under a sedative. Do you think the defense might try to spin it that way?
I do think that the defense is going to try to portray Michael Jackson as an addict and that he was trying to seek drugs and that he was infusing himself with drugs or that he drank them. It's hard to tell what's going to come out and whether it's going to be different from what was actually told to investigators. But the key point here is even if he were an addict, and I'm not still convinced that he was in this particular context and set of facts, then the prescriber had an obligation to take extra care in prescribing medications, especially these that were so dangerous and that could be dependence forming or otherwise. Just exercise great caution. If the family members knew he was drug seeking, then certainly the physician should have known. He's paid $150,000 a month. He certainly should have known. Right? And so he had that extra duty of care. And the breach of duty existed when he provided these medications to him in the first place and in the settings in which he provided them, and then he left him in the room alone with that. You don't leave anyone alone in the room with medications of that type, but especially not someone who might be an addict.
Let's start with Michael Barnes. Taking a look ahead to tomorrow, Michael Barnes, what do you expect the prosecution and the defense to really focus on in their opening statements?
I do think that the defense is going to try to spin Michael Jackson as a drug seeker, as one with a severe addiction who would do anything to get his hands on drugs, and that he was unstoppable when it came to his resources in trying to get his hands on propofol and other anti-anxiety medications. But 2/3 of the jury is going to be made up of people who have alcohol and drug addiction close to their homes. And that's going to be very important to both the defense as well as the prosecution, because the prosecution can then turn that argument around and say, yes, those of you who have this in your life, you know that these people are hard to deal with. But addiction is a brain disease, and it has to be managed medically. This person was hired at $150,000 a month and had an absolute obligation to keep this man safe and healthy. A coma and inject yourself or drink propofol and then die and not be able to be resuscitated all within 2 minutes. It's not possible.
I'll tell you what, it'll be very interesting to see what both sides have to offer. Thank you so much to all of our guests.